Gloomy Sunday, the song that made people end their lives. There's a melody that was composed in Hungary in 1933 that allegedly carries something in its structure, something in the arrangement of notes and the progression of chords that affects human consciousness in ways music isn't supposed to. It's called Gloomy Sunday, and according to legend and scattered documentation, the song has been directly linked to dozens, possibly hundreds, of deaths by suicide. People who heard it and felt compelled to end their lives within hours or days, as if the music planted something in their minds that grew until self-destruction became the only imaginable response. The composer himself eventually took his own life, decades after writing it. The song was banned from radio broadcast in multiple countries. Sheet music was pulled from stores, yet it persists, recorded by major artists, available now to anyone with internet access. The melody waiting in digital archives for the next person who'll hear it and feel something shift inside their consciousness. Some door opening onto darkness that wasn't there before they pressed play. The song was written by Rezo Seres, a Hungarian pianist and composer working in Budapest during the economic devastation of the Great Depression. Europe was drowning in poverty and despair. The future looked apocalyptic, and Seres channeled this collective misery into a composition he initially called Vége Vilányak. The world is ending. The melody is haunting and profoundly melancholic, moving through minor key progressions that create a sense of inexorable descent, of something falling that can never rise again. Lyrics were added later by poet Laszlo Javor, describing a person contemplating joining their deceased lover in death, standing at the edge of that decision while Sunday, traditionally a day of rest and worship, becomes the day they'll choose to end their suffering. The song became popular in Budapest cafes and clubs, but alongside its popularity came disturbing reports. The first alleged suicide connected to the song involved a shoemaker in Budapest who left a note saying he couldn't get the melody out of his head, that it had been playing in his thoughts continuously, driving him to a state where death seemed like the only escape from the music. Then a young woman drowned herself in the Danube after requesting the song at a nightclub. A shopkeeper hung himself with the sheet music for Gloomy Sunday in his pocket. The accounts accumulated, each linking the song to self-inflicted death, until Budapest newspapers began calling it the Hungarian suicide song and warning people against listening to it. The phenomenon spread as the song gained international attention. In America, where it was translated as Gloomy Sunday and recorded by Billie Holiday in 1941, reports emerged of people killing themselves after hearing the recording. A New York typist gassed herself with a copy of the sheet music clutched in her hand. A Berlin man requested the song at a nightclub and shot himself as it played. A London woman overdosed on pills while the record turned on her phonograph, found days later with the needle stuck in the final groove, the melody's ending repeating over and over in the empty room. The BBC banned it. Multiple radio networks across Europe and America refused to play it. Record stores stopped stocking it. Yet the song's reputation only enhanced its dark allure, making people seek it out specifically to hear what was so dangerous, what could possibly be encoded in a simple melody that would make someone choose death. The mechanisms proposed for how the song might work vary from the psychological to the occult. The most rational explanation suggests it's purely contextual. People who are already suicidally depressed are drawn to melancholic music. And Gloomy Sunday, with its reputation and deeply sad melody, becomes a catalyst that pushes them from contemplation to action. The song doesn't cause the suicidal ideation, but crystallizes it, gives it a soundtrack, makes the idea of death seem beautiful or poetic rather than tragic. In this framework, the song is dangerous only to those already vulnerable, and the deaths attributed to it would have occurred anyway. perhaps to different music or triggers. But this doesn't explain the consistency of reports, the specific claims that the melody itself was inescapable, that it played in people's minds without stopping, that it seemed to override other thoughts and create obsessive loops where death became the only coherent concept. Multiple suicide notes from different people in different countries described the same experience. The song wouldn't leave them alone. It played constantly in their heads. They couldn't sleep because the melody continued. They couldn't concentrate on anything else because the music filled their consciousness. This suggests something beyond simple emotional resonance with sad material. It suggests the melody itself has properties that affect cognitive function, that the specific arrangement of intervals and progressions creates states of consciousness that become self-sustaining and harmful. Musical theorists have analyzed the composition looking for what might make it different from other sad songs, why Gloomy Sunday specifically would have effects that thousands of other melancholic melodies don't produce. The chord progressions are unusual, moving in ways that violate listener expectations, creating unresolved tension that the brain struggles to process. The melody doesn't provide the resolution and release that most music offers, doesn't give the listener a sense of completion or emotional arc. It spirals downward without climbing back up, without offering hope or transformation. Listening to it is like watching something fall without ever hitting the ground, descent that continues past the point where it should end, leaving the brain in a state of perpetual anticipation that never gets satisfied. There's also speculation about resonance frequencies, the idea that certain sound patterns can affect brain chemistry or neural oscillations in ways that destabilize mood regulation. If the song happens to hit frequencies or rhythmic patterns that interfere with the brain's normal production or uptake of serotonin or other neurotransmitters involved in mood stability, extended exposure could theoretically push someone from sad to suicidal by literally altering their neurochemistry through sonic input. This remains speculative. No rigorous scientific study has established that Gloomy Sunday affects brain function differently than other music. But the consistency of reports across decades and cultures suggests something about this specific composition, not just its emotional content, but its structural elements, might interact with human consciousness in unusual ways. The more exotic theories suggest intentional encoding, that Seress consciously or unconsciously embedded something in the composition, some pattern or frequency that carries information or influence beyond the surface melody. In occult frameworks, music is understood as vibrational magic, as patterns that shape consciousness and reality through resonance. A composer working in a state of profound despair, channeling the collective anguish of a civilization in collapse, might tap into frequencies that manifest that despair in others, that transmit it like a virus through the medium of melody. The song becomes a carrier wave for the emotional state that created it, infecting listeners with depression so profound that death seems not just acceptable, but necessary. Rezo Seress himself lived with the song's dark reputation for decades. He couldn't escape it. Every interview, every mention of his work, focused on Gloomy Sunday and its alleged body count. The song that should have brought him fame and wealth instead brought notoriety and a kind of cursed celebrity. In 1968, at age 69, Seress jumped from his Budapest apartment window. The song had finally claimed its creator, or perhaps the weight of being associated with so much death, of having composed something that allegedly pushed people toward suicide, became unbearable. His death completed a circle that had begun 35 years earlier, when he first wrote the melody, as if the song had always been leading to this conclusion, had encoded his own death in its structure from the beginning. The question of whether music can actually kill, whether a melody can be so perfectly crafted to trigger self-destruction that hearing it creates genuine danger, challenges our understanding of how consciousness works and how much external input can affect internal states. We know music affects mood. It's used therapeutically to manage depression and anxiety, used commercially to manipulate purchasing behavior, used in warfare to disorient or break enemy combatants. But the idea that a single song could consistently push vulnerable people over the edge from depression into suicide implies a level of power that most people are uncomfortable attributing to art. Yet the deaths connected to Gloomy Sunday are documented in newspapers and police reports from the 1930s and 40s. Some can be verified, others remain anecdotal, and the actual number is impossible to confirm because causes of suicide are complex, and many people who died may have heard the song without anyone knowing. It played a role in their decision. But dismissing all of it as urban legend ignores substantial historical documentation that something unusual was happening, that enough suicides were linked to this specific song that multiple governments took action to restrict its broadcast and distribution. Modern listeners can find the song easily online, can hear various recordings, and judge for themselves whether it produces unusual effects. Most report finding it sad and haunting, but not dangerous, not producing anything beyond ordinary emotional response to melancholic music. But occasionally, someone will comment that they had to stop listening, that it affected them more deeply than music should, that it created a heaviness or despair that lingered for hours or days, that the melody did stick in their mind in ways that felt invasive rather than just catchy. These contemporary reports echo the historical accounts. Most people are unaffected beyond normal sadness, but a subset experiences something more intense, something that suggests individual vulnerability to whatever the song carries. The song exists in multiple versions, each with slightly different arrangements and lyrics. The Billie Holiday recording is probably the most famous, her voice adding layers of lived pain to the already mournful melody. Some versions are purely instrumental, removing the explicit suicide ideation from the lyrics while maintaining the musical structure that allegedly caused the original effects. If the danger is in the melody itself, rather than the lyrical content, then instrumental versions should be equally problematic. If it's the combination of music and words that creates the effect, then instrumental versions should be safer. Reports don't clearly support either conclusion. Both lyrical and instrumental versions have been associated with listener distress. There are also claims that certain recordings are more dangerous than others, that early pressings or specific performances captured something that later, cleaned-up versions smoothed out. Audiophiles and collectors speak about original pressings having a rawness or quality that reissues lack, and in the case of Gloomy Sunday, this might not just be about sound fidelity, but about how completely the despair and darkness of the original composition and performance was preserved. Modern digital remasters might technically sound better while removing some essential quality that made the song dangerous, sanitizing it in the process of making it clearer. The persistence of the song, despite its reputation, suggests that banning it doesn't work, that prohibition only increases its appeal. People seek out dangerous things, want to experience what others have warned against, believe they'll be the exception who can handle it. Gloomy Sunday exists now as freely available digital audio, and anyone reading about its history can find and play it within seconds. If it truly is dangerous, then making it easily accessible seems reckless. If it's not, then its reputation is built on coincidence and myth, and there's no harm in listening. But the uncertainty itself is troubling. We don't actually know for certain whether the song has properties that make it hazardous to vulnerable individuals, and our culture has decided that availability is more important than potential risk. What we're left with is a melody composed during humanity's darkest hours between the wars, A song that captured something essential about despair and hopelessness, that became associated with dozens of deaths by suicide, that was banned and feared and sought after, that killed its own composer decades after he wrote it, and that exists now as a historical curiosity that most people can listen to safely, while a small percentage might experience something that proves the legends weren't entirely fabricated. Whether Gloomy Sunday actually has power to push vulnerable minds towards self-destruction, or whether it simply became a focal point for suicide contagion during an era of widespread despair. The accumulated weight of its history suggests that some melodies carry more than just notes and rhythm, that music can be a vector for states of consciousness that transcend simple emotion, and that a song written to express the feeling that the world is ending might have succeeded so perfectly in capturing that feeling that it transmits it like a virus to anyone who opens their mind to receive it, leaving them infected with despair that has no antidote except silence, except stopping the music, except ensuring that the melody finally, permanently ends. Quantum immortality. You've died many times but keep shifting. There's a disturbing philosophical implication of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. A thought experiment that, if taken seriously, suggests that from your subjective perspective, you can never actually experience death, that every time you face a potentially fatal situation, a car accident where you should have died, an illness that should have been terminal, a moment of danger where survival required improbable luck, you don't experience the timelines where you die, because dead observers can't experience anything, but instead, your consciousness continues only in the quantum branches where you survived, no matter how improbable those branches become, creating situation where from your internal perspective, you're functionally immortal, always finding yourself in the timeline where you lived, where the cancer went into unexpected remission, where the bullet missed by inches, where the accident that killed others somehow spared you, where improbable survival after improbable survival accumulates until you begin to notice that you've been extraordinarily lucky, that you've survived things you shouldn't have survived, that people around you die in circumstances similar to ones you've experienced, but somehow you always make it through, suggesting that you've actually died many times in other quantum branches. But your consciousness only persists in the branches where you survived, where you're still experiencing reality, where you continue to exist no matter how unlikely your continued existence becomes from external statistical perspective, making you quantum immortal from your subjective viewpoint. Even though in the vast majority of quantum branches you're dead, even though most versions of you died in that car accident, or from that disease, or in that moment of danger. But the versions that died aren't experiencing anything anymore, aren't continuing in any timeline, while you, the experiencing subject reading this, only exist in timelines where you survived, creating anthropic selection effect where your continued existence proves nothing about how likely your survival was, only that in the timeline you're experiencing you survived, because that's the only kind of timeline you could be experiencing, because dead versions of you aren't experiencing timelines where they died, making death impossible to experience, even though it's constantly occurring in adjacent quantum branches, leaving you immortal from your perspective while mortal from everyone else's perspective, creating bizarre asymmetry where you can watch others die, can experience their permanent absence, but can never experience your own death. Because the moment you would die, your consciousness simply continues, only in branches where you didn't, where something improbable saved you, where quantum probability happened to break in the direction that preserved your existence. And if this pattern continues indefinitely, you should expect your subjective experience to become increasingly improbable, to involve more and more unlikely survivals, more and more situations where everyone around you is asking how you made it through, where your continued existence becomes statistically anomalous, where you start to notice that you're the luckiest person you know, that you've survived situations that killed others. That probability seems to bend in your favor in ways that would be remarkable if you were just one person in one timeline. But that makes perfect sense if you're one consciousness experiencing only the subset of quantum branches, where you survived while being oblivious to the vastly more numerous branches where you died, making quantum immortality simultaneously comforting. You never experience death, and disturbing. Everyone you know will eventually die from your perspective, while you continue on in increasingly improbable timelines, potentially watching the universe age around you while you persist, because there's always some quantum branch, no matter how unlikely, where you survive another day, where your consciousness shifts to another improbable survival, where death remains forever in your future, never in your experienced present, making quantum immortality less about living forever and more about being trapped in consciousness that can't experience its own ending, that shifts between timelines without knowing it's shifting, that mistakes its string of improbable survivals for luck or divine protection or simple persistence when it might actually be quantum mechanical necessity, might be the inescapable consequence of consciousness only being able to experience timelines where it exists, leaving you to wonder whether the close calls you've had, the near misses and the unexpected recoveries, were actually close calls where you barely survived in this timeline, or whether they were deaths in other timelines that you only remember from the surviving side, whether you've already died 100 times, but your consciousness only exists in branches where you didn't, making this timeline, this moment, this continuation of experience, just one of infinitely many quantum branches. But the only one you can experience, because all the others where you died aren't available to you, aren't experienceable by you, aren't part of your subjective reality, no matter how objectively real they are in the multiverse, leaving you immortal until you're not, until the final death that occurs across all remaining quantum branches simultaneously, until the moment when no branches remain where you survive, which if you're young and healthy, might be decades or centuries in your subjective future, but which if you're old or sick, might be imminent, might be approaching as the set of possible survival branches narrows, as probability constrains the multiverse toward outcomes where your continued existence becomes impossible across all branches, where quantum immortality finally ends, not because you experience death, but because there are no more branches for your consciousness to shift to, no more improbable survivals available, no more quantum timelines where you continue, leaving you to wonder whether every moment of continued existence is a shift, is a death survived in other branches, is a consciousness that persists only because it must persist in any timeline where it experiences anything at all, making you simultaneously mortal and immortal, depending on which perspective you take. Mortal from outside, where observers see you age and eventually die. Immortal from inside, where you experience nothing but continuation, nothing but survival, nothing but the next moment and the next, each one representing a quantum branch where you still exist, while innumerable branches where you died proceed without you, without your consciousness, without your subjective experience of their reality, leaving quantum immortality as either profound truth about the nature of conscious experience in many worlds universe, or as philosophical confusion about what consciousness and death actually mean, or as both simultaneously, a framework that might be descriptively accurate about your subjective experience, even if it doesn't change the objective reality of your mortality, doesn't prevent your death in most branches, doesn't save you from aging and entropy, and the eventual heat death of the universe. But that does predict and explain the pattern of your subjective experience. The fact that you're alive right now, to read this, that you've survived every danger you've faced so far, that you're experiencing continuation, which is exactly what quantum immortality predicts you'll always experience until the very end, until all branches close, until the shifting stops, leaving you to wonder in every moment whether you just survived something in another branch, whether the life you're living is the improbable one, whether you're immortal in the only way that matters, subjectively, experientially, continuously, unable to experience the deaths that are happening to you across the multiverse, because you only exist where you exist, only persist where you persist, only shift between the branches where you're alive to shift, making quantum immortality not a gift, but a description, not salvation, but explanation, not eternal life, but subjective inability to experience anything except life continuing, moment after moment, breath after breath, shift after shift between quantum branches you'll never know you're shifting between, deaths you'll never know you died, survivals you'll never know were improbable, until the end, whenever and however that comes, in the final moment that closes all branches, that makes continuation impossible, that ends the shifting and ends the immortality and ends the consciousness that could only ever experience its own continuation, never its own cessation, making you functionally immortal until you're not, quantum protected until you're not, continuously experiencing life until experience itself ends, leaving quantum immortality as either the most profound truth about conscious existence or the most elaborate philosophical confusion about what death means and what consciousness is, and whether subjective experience in many worlds' universe really does create functional immortality from internal perspective, even while objective mortality proceeds normally from external perspective, leaving you, the conscious experiencer reading this, surviving this moment, existing in this branch, to wonder whether you've already died 1,000 times, but only remember the survivals, whether the close calls were closer than you think, whether you're immortal in the only way a conscious being can be immortal, by never experiencing anything except the continuation of experience, the persistence of awareness, the next moment arriving after this one, in an unbroken chain that feels like it could never end, even though it will, even though it must, even though quantum immortality isn't really immortality, but just the observer selection effect that guarantees you only experience timelines where you're alive to experience them, making every moment of your life a triumph of improbable survival, a shift to the branch where you persist, a continuation that's simultaneously inevitable from your perspective and unlikely from the multiverse's perspective, leaving you alive, conscious, reading this, experiencing this moment in the quantum branch where you survived to experience it, while other versions of you in other branches didn't survive, aren't reading this, aren't experiencing anything, aren't part of your subjective reality, aren't available to you, leaving only this, only now, only the continuous experience of being alive in the branches where you're alive, immortal until the final death. Quantum protected until all branches close, shifting between possibilities until no possibilities remain, making quantum immortality both true and meaningless, both profound and trivial, both the most important fact about your existence and completely irrelevant to how you live. Because whether you're shifting between branches or simply living in one, whether you've died 1,000 times or never died at all, the subjective experience is identical. You're here, now, alive, conscious, experiencing this moment, unable to experience any moment where you're not, making quantum immortality simultaneously the deepest truth about consciousness and the most obvious tautology. You experience being alive because that's the only thing you can experience. You survive every danger from your perspective because dead perspectives don't persist. You're immortal until you're not, quantum protected until protection ends, shifting through branches of survival until no branches remain. And then, in that final moment that you'll never experience, quantum immortality ends, the shifting stops, consciousness ceases, and the immortality that was never really immortality reveals itself as just the observer selection effect applied to consciousness across many worlds, leaving you while you exist, while you shift, while you survive, functionally immortal, subjectively unkillable, continuously experiencing life because that's the only thing consciousness can do. Persist in the branches where it persists, shift to the survivals, experience the continuations, be alive in all the ways that matter for as long as any branches remain, where being alive is possible, making you quantum immortal. Right now, in this moment, for as long as this moment lasts, for as long as the branches remain open, for as long as consciousness continues to shift between the survivals that define your subjective experience of reality, leaving quantum immortality as either profound truth or philosophical confusion, or both, either comfort or horror, or both, either the secret of eternal life or just the tautology that you're alive right now and can only experience timelines where you're alive, making you immortal in the only way consciousness can be immortal. By never experiencing its own ending, by always finding itself in the next moment, by shifting through quantum branches without knowing it's shifting, dying in other timelines without knowing it's dying, surviving by necessity in the only timeline it can experience. This one, right now, where you're alive, reading this, contemplating quantum immortality, wondering whether you've already died and shifted, whether the close calls were deaths elsewhere, whether you're immortal or just lucky, or whether those are the same thing in many worlds universe, where consciousness persists only where it persists, making quantum immortality true by definition and trivial by implication, both everything and nothing, both the deepest mystery of existence and the most obvious feature of subjective experience, leaving you, the eternal experiencer, the quantum survivor, the consciousness that shifts, alive until the final shift, immortal until immortality ends, experiencing life because that's all you can experience, in the quantum branches where you survived to experience anything at all. Dulce Base, underground human-alien genetic experiments. Beneath the desert rock of northern New Mexico, near the small town of Dulce on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, something allegedly exists that the government will never acknowledge. Not a storage facility, not a communications hub, not a simple underground military installation, like hundreds of others scattered across the American Southwest. According to those who claim to have worked there, to have been held there, or to have stumbled upon evidence of its existence, Dulce Base is a joint human-alien facility descending 7 levels deep into the earth, where genetic experiments are conducted that violate every understanding of ethics, biology, and human rights. The deeper you go, the darker the work becomes, until at the lowest levels, you find things that can't be called human anymore. Things that were human once, things created from scratch that were never human at all. If even a fraction of what whistleblowers describe is true, then everything we've been told about alien contact, government cooperation, and the sanctity of human autonomy is a comfortable lie masking a nightmare operating just beneath our feet. The story of Dulce Base emerged primarily through the testimony of Phil Schneider and Thomas Costello, 2 men who claimed direct involvement with the facility and who both met mysterious ends after going public with their allegations. Schneider described himself as a geological engineer, working on underground base construction for the government and military contractors. In the late 1970s, he was allegedly part of a drilling operation near Dulce when they broke through into an existing cavern system. What they found inside wasn't natural. The caverns had been modified, expanded, and occupied by beings that weren't human. A firefight erupted, Schneider was injured, and in the chaos he claimed to have seen technology and entities that convinced him humanity had made agreements with extraterrestrial species, agreements that traded access to human subjects for technological knowledge. Thomas Costello claimed to be a security officer at Dulce Base, working in the facility for years before his conscience or his fear drove him to leave and attempt to expose what was happening. He described a massive multi-level complex built into the mesa, with the upper levels occupied by human personnel and conventional operations. Offices, security stations, storage areas that could plausibly be explained if discovered. But the lower levels, accessed through security checkpoints that grew progressively more restrictive, contained laboratories where the line between human and alien blurred until it dissolved entirely. Costello spoke of seeing humans in cages, of witnessing procedures where genetics were being manipulated, where consciousness was being altered or transferred, where things that had started as human were being transformed into something else entirely. The facility is described as a joint operation with human scientists and military personnel working alongside gray aliens. The archetypal beings with large heads, enormous black eyes, and thin bodies that appear in countless abduction reports. But according to Dulce witnesses, these grays aren't simply visiting. They're resident, permanent, occupying sections of the base, as if it's their facility as much as ours. The cooperation between human and alien personnel is described as hierarchical but complex, with some areas off limits to humans, others restricted to specific clearance levels, and tension between the two species barely contained beneath operational protocols. This isn't peaceful scientific collaboration. It's an arrangement born from power imbalance, from humanity's desperation for advanced technology and the aliens' need for something we possess: biological material, genetic diversity, or access to human consciousness for purposes we can't fully understand. Level 6 and 7 are where the horror intensifies according to testimony. Costello described rows of cages containing humans in various states of alteration. Some appeared drugged, barely conscious, bodies showing signs of surgical intervention or genetic modification. Others were hybrids, beings that combined human and alien features in ways that suggested they'd been created rather than born, grown in artificial wombs or vats for purposes that remained obscure. He spoke of a section he called Nightmare Hall, where the most extreme experiments were conducted, where things existed that couldn't be categorized as human or alien, but represented some twisted fusion of both. The suffering in these areas was immense, though many subjects appeared too altered to fully comprehend their condition, their minds broken or modified along with their bodies. The genetic work allegedly pursued at Dulce involves attempts to create hybrid species that combine human adaptability and consciousness with alien physiology and abilities. The Greys, some theories suggest, are themselves a dying species, genetically stagnant, unable to reproduce successfully without outside intervention. Their interest in human genetics stems from desperate need. We possess something they've lost, some vitality or diversity that could revive their species or create a hybrid successor. The experiments explore which human traits are compatible with alien genetics, how consciousness translates between species, whether the essential qualities that make us human can survive being housed in non-human biology. Each hybrid represents data. Each failed experiment teaches them something, and the human cost is apparently acceptable to whatever authority authorized this arrangement. But hybridization flows both ways, according to some accounts. Human subjects are allegedly modified to be more alien, to survive in different atmospheric conditions, or to possess enhanced abilities. These experiments test the limits of how far human biology can be pushed before something fundamental breaks. Costello described subjects whose skeletal structure had been altered, whose organs had been modified or replaced with artificial or alien equivalents, whose nervous systems had been augmented with technology that blurred the line between living tissue and machine. The goal, he suggested, was creating humans who could survive extreme environments, who could interface directly with alien technology, or who could serve purposes that normal human biology wouldn't permit. The question of consent is central to the horror of Dulce. Where do these subjects come from? Abduction reports have been documented for decades, people claiming to be taken against their will, subjected to medical procedures aboard craft or in facilities they couldn't identify, then returned with missing time and fragmentary memories. Skeptics attribute these to sleep paralysis, false memories, or psychological conditions. But if Dulce exists, if underground facilities are conducting genetic experiments requiring human subjects, then abduction would be the mechanism for acquiring test subjects who won't be missed, or whose disappearance can be explained away. Missing person statistics show thousands of people vanishing every year without resolution. How many might have ended up in facilities like Dulce, their disappearance attributed to running away, foul play, or voluntary departure, when the truth is imprisonment in underground laboratories where their humanity is systematically stripped away. The technology described at Dulce goes beyond genetics. Costello spoke of vats where beings were grown rapidly from genetic templates, artificial wombs that could produce a fully developed hybrid in months, rather than the 9-month human gestation period. He described devices that could extract consciousness or transfer it between bodies, technology that treated the mind as software that could be copied, moved, or deleted. The implications are staggering. If consciousness can be extracted and stored, then death becomes optional for those with access to the technology. If it can be transferred, then bodies become disposable vehicles. If it can be copied, then the very concept of individual identity dissolves. What would you call a being that has your memories, your personality, your sense of self, but exists in a cloned body or an alien form? Is it you? Is it a copy? Does the distinction even matter? The alleged 1979 incident at Dulce represents a moment when cooperation collapsed into violence. According to Schneider and others, human personnel became increasingly disturbed by what they were witnessing in the lower levels. The treatment of human subjects, the nature of the experiments, the goals that seemed to serve alien interests far more than human benefit. Tension grew until it erupted into armed conflict. Humans and aliens exchanged fire in the underground tunnels. Casualties occurred on both sides. Schneider claimed to have been hit by an alien weapon that nearly killed him. Other sources suggest dozens died in the firefight before the situation was contained. Afterward, security was tightened. Human access to the lower levels became even more restricted, and anyone who knew too much about what sparked the conflict was reassigned or eliminated. The town of Dulce itself sits unaware above these alleged horrors. Population around 3,000, mostly Jicarilla Apache, living ordinary lives with no knowledge that beneath them might exist one of the most significant and disturbing secrets in human history. Except that some residents report strange things. Unexplained aircraft, particularly at night, lights moving in patterns that don't match conventional aviation, cattle mutilations that plague the region, animals found drained of blood with surgical precision, organs removed in ways that suggest advanced technology and purposes beyond simple predation or ritual. Sounds from beneath the ground, vibrations felt through the earth, phenomena that could be dismissed individually but collectively paint a picture of something unusual occurring in the area. The military presence near Dulce is documented and undeniable. Los Alamos National Laboratory, where nuclear weapons research continues, sits less than 100 miles away. Kirtland Air Force Base, associated with nuclear weapons and special projects, is nearby. The region has been home to classified research for decades, with vast stretches of federal land closed to public access. The infrastructure for underground facilities exists. We know the government has built installations below ground for continuity of operations, for storing sensitive materials, for conducting research that requires isolation. The question isn't whether underground bases exist in the Southwest. The question is what's being done in them, and whether any involve cooperation with non-human intelligence. Skeptics point to the lack of physical evidence, the absence of satellite imagery, showing the massive ventilation systems and power infrastructure that a 7-level underground facility would require, the fact that both primary witnesses are dead and their claims can't be verified. Phil Schneider died in 1996, found strangled with a catheter tube wrapped around his neck, officially ruled a suicide despite the manner of death and his repeated statements that he feared assassination. Thomas Costello disappeared in the late 80s after allegedly stealing photographs and video from Dulce Base, materials that were supposed to prove his claims but have never surfaced publicly. His wife and child disappeared with him. No bodies were found. No trace of their whereabouts has emerged. This could mean they're living under assumed identities in hiding, or it could mean they were eliminated along with the evidence they carried. The deeper implication of Dulce, if any version of it is real, extends beyond genetic experiments. It suggests a relationship between human government, presumably elements operating above conventional oversight, and alien species, a relationship based on trade, technology for access, advanced knowledge for biological material. The cooperation required to build and operate a joint facility implies communication, negotiation, agreements. When did this relationship begin? What authority decided humanity would enter into this arrangement? What were we promised in exchange for giving alien intelligence access to human subjects? And most disturbing, what happens if we try to back out of the agreement now? Do we even have that option, or have we become dependent on whatever technology we've received, locked into a relationship we can't escape without losing capabilities that have become essential? The genetic experiments also raise questions about other programs and phenomena. Are some UFO abductions actually human military operations designed to provide subjects for Dulce-like facilities while maintaining the alien cover story? Are the hybrids being created eventually released into the human population, walking among us indistinguishable from normal humans, but engineered for purposes we can't detect? Do the modifications and procedures pioneered on non-consenting subjects at Dulce eventually get refined and offered as enhancements to elite humans, creating a breakaway civilization that's genetically diverging from baseline humanity? Each question spawns more questions, a fractal of disturbing possibilities branching from the central premise that somewhere beneath the New Mexico desert, in laboratories carved into ancient rock, the boundaries of species and consciousness are being violated in the name of advancement or survival, or purposes we aren't meant to understand. Visitors to the Dulce area sometimes report strange compulsions, feelings of being watched, dreams or visions of underground facilities and gray figures, missing time they can't account for. These experiences could be suggestibility, the power of expecting to experience something unusual in a location associated with conspiracy theories. Or they could be residual effects of whatever actually occurs there, psychic contamination from the suffering and violation happening below. Or active scanning and influence from the facility's occupants, ensuring that no one who gets too close remembers enough to cause problems. The desert keeps secrets well, and the earth provides perfect cover for operations that must never see daylight. Whether Dulce Base exists exactly as described, whether it's a distorted version of something that operates differently than witnesses understood, or whether it's entirely fabricated from fear and speculation, the concept resonates because it crystallizes anxieties we all carry about government secrecy, alien contact, and bodily autonomy. The fear that authorities have made deals we didn't consent to. The terror that advanced beings view us as resources rather than equals. The nightmare that human bodies and consciousness could be manipulated without permission or recourse. Dulce Base is where all these fears converge, beneath the earth, hidden from oversight, operating according to ethics that would horrify anyone who learned the details. And if Phil Schneider and Thomas Costello were telling the truth, if their deaths were the cost of trying to expose what they knew, then somewhere right now, beneath the desert, in levels descending deeper into darkness, work continues that we're better off never seeing. Experiments proceeding that answer questions we should never have asked, creating beings that should never exist. All in service of an arrangement between species that treats humanity not as partners, but as livestock, raw material for an agenda we'll never be permitted to fully understand. Project Looking Glass, technology that shows all possible futures. There's a persistent claim within conspiracy theory circles and among certain alleged whistleblowers that the United States government, possibly operating through classified programs at facilities like Area 51 or S4, possesses technology called Project Looking Glass, a device that allegedly allows operators to view probable future timelines by manipulating quantum probability fields, or by creating localized distortions in space-time that permit observation of events that haven't yet occurred from our temporal perspective. According to testimony from people claiming to have worked on or near the project, Looking Glass consists of a cylindrical apparatus, possibly involving rotating rings of exotic matter or electromagnetic field generators arranged to create specific space-time geometries, with a viewing screen or interface where operators can observe scenes from potential futures, witnessing outcomes of current decisions, seeing technological developments before they occur, observing catastrophes before they happen, essentially possessing a window into tomorrow that provides enormous strategic advantage to whoever controls it, the ability to make decisions with knowledge of their consequences, to avoid disasters by seeing them coming, to steal technological innovations by observing them in the future and developing them in the present, to win wars by knowing enemy actions before they're taken, to manipulate markets by foreseeing economic shifts, to control society by steering toward desired futures while avoiding timelines that contain undesirable outcomes. The existence of such technology would represent the ultimate information advantage, would explain certain prescient decisions or seemingly miraculous avoidance of catastrophes, would provide framework for understanding how elite groups might maintain power across generations by possessing knowledge of future events that allows them to position themselves optimally while everyone else operates blind, making decisions based on incomplete information about probable outcomes, while the Looking Glass operators possess clarity about which choices lead where. But the evidence for Project Looking Glass consists entirely of whistleblower testimony from individuals whose credentials are difficult to verify, whose access to classified programs can't be independently confirmed, and whose descriptions of the technology are vague enough to avoid specific falsifiable claims while dramatic enough to capture imagination, creating a situation where Looking Glass exists in permanent evidential limbo. Either the most significant classified technology in human possession, proving that future viewing is possible and that powerful groups have been using this capability to shape history according to their preferences, or an elaborate fiction, a story that combines real classified program names with fictional capabilities, that borrows from legitimate physics concepts about time and probability, while applying them in ways that actual physics doesn't support, that serves the conspiracy theory purpose of explaining why elites seem to always win, why certain groups maintain power despite apparent disadvantages, why history sometimes unfolds in ways that seem too convenient or too orchestrated to be mere chance, providing narrative framework where everything is planned, where accident and chaos are illusions, where those in control are operating with knowledge of future outcomes that makes their success inevitable rather than achieved through the messy contingent processes of actual history, leaving Project Looking Glass as either suppressed scientific breakthrough that proves time isn't linear and that future observation is achievable through sufficiently advanced technology, or as mythology, as story that believers in conspiracy need to be true to make sense of world, where power concentrates despite democratic institutions, where elite coordination seems too effective to be mere networking and shared interest, where the alternative, that Looking Glass doesn't exist and elites are just wealthy humans making educated guesses and sometimes getting lucky, feels less satisfying than believing in secret technology that explains everything. The primary source for Project Looking Glass claims is Dan Burisch, also known as Dan Crane, who emerged in the early 2000s claiming to be a microbiologist who had worked on classified projects at Area 51 and S4, who had been exposed to various secret programs, including one involving time viewing technology. Burisch provided detailed accounts of Looking Glass in interviews, describing it as a cylindrical device several meters long, involving rotating components, creating what he described as an Einstein-Rosen bridge, or controlled wormhole that could be tuned to observe different probable future timelines. He claimed that multiple Looking Glass devices existed, that they were built using technology reverse-engineered from extraterrestrial craft, or that they were developed through black-budget physics programs that achieved breakthroughs far beyond publicly acknowledged science. According to Burisch, Looking Glass showed operators that all observed futures converged toward a specific event or timeline convergence in the early 21st century, beyond which the futures diverged dramatically into either catastrophic or transcendent outcomes for humanity. This convergence point allegedly limited the device's usefulness because futures beyond it were unstable or couldn't be clearly observed, creating strategic problem for those using the technology. They could see consequences of current actions only up to this convergence point, beyond which all timelines became chaotic or uncertain, suggesting that humanity faced a crucial juncture where decisions made would determine which of the divergent post-convergence futures would manifest. The physics that would be required for Looking Glass to function as described doesn't exist in any verified form. Observing future events would require either faster-than-light information transfer, which relativity forbids, or would require that futures already exist in some sense, that time is block universe where past, present, and future coexist, and Looking Glass is simply a device for directing observation toward the future sections of the block. Even accepting block universe interpretation, the mechanism by which electromagnetic fields or rotating components could shift observation through time, isn't described by any known physics. The Einstein-Rosen bridge, mentioned by Burisch, is real concept from general relativity, a theoretical connection between distant points in space-time, commonly called a wormhole. But whether such structures can actually form, whether they could be stabilized, and whether they could be used for information transfer or observation, much less for viewing future events, remains entirely speculative and faces severe theoretical obstacles. The quantum probability interpretation that some Looking Glass accounts invoke suggests the device isn't viewing a predetermined future, but rather sampling from probability distributions, observing possible futures weighted by their likelihood, similar to many worlds interpretation, where all quantum possibilities branch into separate realities. In this framework, Looking Glass would show operators the most probable outcomes, given current conditions, allowing them to adjust variables to steer toward preferred probability branches. But this doesn't align with how quantum mechanics actually functions at macroscopic scales. Quantum indeterminacy averages out in large systems, making the future probabilistically predictable through normal analysis, rather than requiring exotic viewing technology. Classical chaos theory and complex systems modeling provide methods for forecasting probable futures without invoking quantum mechanics or time viewing technology. The strategic implications, if Looking Glass exists, would be profound. Any government or group possessing reliable future viewing technology would have insurmountable advantage over those without it. Military conflicts would be won before they started by side that could foresee enemy actions. Economic markets would be dominated by those who could see future prices and developments. Political battles would be controlled by those who could test messages and policies by observing their future effects. The technology would be so valuable that its very existence would be the most closely guarded secret, protected at any cost, because losing it or allowing adversaries to develop their own version would eliminate the advantage it provides. This raises the question of why, if Looking Glass exists, the United States or whoever possesses it hasn't achieved complete global domination. If you can see all possible futures and choose actions that lead to preferred outcomes, you should be effectively omniscient within the time range the technology permits viewing. The fact that geopolitical competition continues, that US strategic initiatives sometimes fail, that unexpected events occur that seemingly could have been foreseen and prevented, suggests either that Looking Glass doesn't exist, or that its capabilities are far more limited than the dramatic description suggests, or that other powers possess similar technology, creating a stalemate where everyone can see futures. But no one gains decisive advantage because all players are operating with similar information. The convergence point that Burish describes, a moment beyond which futures become chaotic and unpredictable, provides narrative explanation for why Looking Glass hasn't prevented all problems or created perfect control. If the technology only works up to a certain temporal horizon, and if we're currently near or past that horizon, then its utility would be limited. The convergence could represent limitations in the technology itself, or could represent actual properties of time and causality, where prediction becomes impossible beyond certain complexity thresholds, or where quantum indeterminacy accumulated over time makes futures genuinely undetermined beyond specific temporal distance. The connection to extraterrestrial technology that appears in some Looking Glass accounts places the device within broader UFO conspiracy narratives. If Looking Glass was reverse engineered from alien craft, it implies that advanced civilizations possess time viewing capabilities, that such technology is achievable given sufficient scientific advancement, and that humans have gained access to it through recovered alien equipment rather than through our own research breakthroughs. This narrative serves to explain how humans could possess technology that seems to require physics far beyond our current understanding. We didn't develop it ourselves. We copied it from beings with thousands or millions of years of advancement beyond us. But this explanation requires accepting the premise that alien craft have been recovered, that reverse engineering alien technology is feasible despite the likely enormous gap in scientific principles and engineering approaches, and that the resulting device works despite humans not fully understanding the physics that underlies its operation. Each of these premises is controversial and unsupported by public evidence, making the alien origin story for Looking Glass depend on accepting multiple extraordinary claims that are themselves disputed. The alternative explanation is that Project Looking Glass exists as a real program name, but that the capabilities attributed to it are misunderstood or misrepresented. Classified research into various exotic physics concepts, wormholes, time dilation effects, quantum computing applications to forecasting, might operate under code names that include Looking Glass. Whistleblowers with partial access or understanding might conflate separate programs, might misinterpret what they saw or were told, might elaborate based on speculation rather than direct knowledge, creating accounts that mix real program names and real physics concepts with fictional capabilities that sound plausible to non-experts, but that don't match what the actual classified research achieved. The Project Preserve Destiny name appears in some accounts alongside or interchangeably with Looking Glass, sometimes described as overlapping programs or as different code names for the same technology at different periods. The proliferation of names and the variations in descriptions across different whistleblower accounts suggest either a complex history of multiple related programs with different capabilities and designations, or suggest that the accounts are elaborations and variations on a theme, rather than consistent testimony about a single, real technology. The societal control implications are central to why Looking Glass features in conspiracy theories. If government or elite groups possess future viewing technology, it transforms democracy and free will into theater. The outcomes are already known. Decisions are made by those with access to Looking Glass, who can see consequences. And the public participation in governance is meaningless because those in control are operating with information advantage so profound that manipulation is trivial. Every election, every policy debate, every social movement occurs within framework shaped by those who can see futures and steer society toward timelines they prefer. This narrative is psychologically appealing to conspiracy theorists because it provides totalizing explanation for complexity and inequality. The world isn't messy and chaotic with distributed power and genuine uncertainty about futures. Instead, it's controlled and predicted by hidden elite using suppressed technology. This explanation makes history comprehensible as planned sequence rather than as emergent property of millions of independent actors making decisions with limited information. It replaces chaos with control, accident with design, complexity with conspiracy. But evidence for Looking Glass remains elusive. Burish's testimony is detailed and internally consistent within his narrative, but his credentials have been questioned. His claimed positions at classified facilities can't be independently verified, and no physical evidence or documentation has been produced beyond his testimony and testimony from others in the same conspiracy theory communities. The accounts exist in an ecosystem where verification is impossible. The programs are too classified. The witnesses are threatened or suppressed. The evidence is destroyed or remains hidden in facilities that public researchers can't access. Every absence of evidence is explained as successful suppression, rather than as indication that the claims might be false. The question of whether we should want Looking Glass to exist is ethically complex. Future viewing technology could prevent catastrophes, could allow optimization of decisions for human benefit, could reduce suffering by allowing problems to be foreseen and addressed before they occur. But it could also enable unprecedented control, could eliminate genuine free will and uncertainty that many philosophers consider essential to meaning and ethics, could create two-tier society where those with access to future knowledge dominate those without. The technology would be so powerful that its misuse would be catastrophic, making it potentially more dangerous than beneficial, unless its control and use were perfectly ethical, which no human institution has ever achieved. Whether Project Looking Glass exists as described, exists in limited form far less dramatic than whistleblower accounts suggest, or doesn't exist at all and represents mythology that serves conspiracy theory purposes by providing explanation for elite power and coordination. The story demonstrates human fascination with time, with future knowledge, with the possibility of gaining information advantage that would transform powerlessness into control, uncertainty into confidence, chaos into predictability. The desire for Looking Glass to exist reflects desire to believe that someone knows what's coming, that history isn't random but planned, that the future isn't fundamentally uncertain, but is knowable to those with right technology, even if we're not among those privileged few with access. The story persists because it can't be definitively disproven. Classified programs, by definition, don't have publicly accessible documentation. Suppressed technology, by definition, doesn't appear in scientific literature. And whistleblowers telling truth about highly classified breakthrough technology would face exactly the credibility problems and verification obstacles that LookingGlass witnesses face, making legitimate disclosure indistinguishable from fabrication unless physical evidence can be produced, which whistleblowers claim is impossible due to classification and security. This creates perfect, unfalsifiable conspiracy theory. All confirming evidence is suppressed. All disconfirming evidence is explained away. Belief or disbelief depends entirely on prior probability assessments about whether such technology is plausible and whether governments would develop and conceal it. Project LookingGlass remains what it has been since the claims first circulated, either the most significant classified technology in existence, proving that future viewing is achievable and that powerful groups have used this capability to shape history while keeping humanity ignorant of time's true nature and the malleability of destiny. Or a compelling fiction, a story that combines classified program nomenclature with speculative physics and conspiracy theory to create narrative that explains too much, that accounts for elite power through suppressed technology rather than through the mundane mechanisms of wealth, networks, information, asymmetry, and institutional advantage, leaving LookingGlass suspended between extraordinary truth and elaborate fiction, between classified breakthrough and mythological projection, between the device that shows all possible futures and the story that shows all possible conspiracy theories, existing in permanent uncertainty. Because verification requires access that isn't available. Because the extraordinary claims lack extraordinary evidence. Because whistleblower testimony without physical proof or corroboration creates belief rather than knowledge, faith rather than certainty, leaving those who encounter the LookingGlass story to decide for themselves whether time-viewing technology exists in classified facilities, whether operators right now are observing futures and making decisions based on knowledge of consequences, whether history is guided by those who can see tomorrow, or whether LookingGlass is myth, is legend, is the conspiracy theory that makes elite power comprehensible by attributing it to suppressed technology, rather than to the complex emergent properties of human societies, where power concentrates through mechanisms that don't require future-viewing devices, where decisions are made with uncertainty and imperfect information by everyone including the powerful, where the future remains genuinely unknown to all, where Project LookingGlass exists not as technology, but as story, as explanation, as the narrative that makes conspiracy theorists comfortable with worlds they can't otherwise understand, giving them framework where everything is planned and controlled rather than chaotic and contingent, where someone knows what's coming even if that someone isn't them, where the LookingGlass operators guide history toward predetermined outcomes while the rest of us live in ignorance, believing we're making choices that matter when the futures have already been observed and decisions have already been made by those with access to technology that shouldn't exist but that allegedly does. Technology that remains forever just beyond proof, forever just beyond verification, forever suspended in testimonial claims that can't be confirmed or denied without access to classified programs that may contain Project LookingGlass, or may contain nothing, may show all possible futures, or may show nothing at all except the human tendency to create myths about secret technology that explains why power concentrates and why elites win, why history unfolds as it does, and why ordinary people feel powerless, answered not by LookingGlass technology that doesn't exist, but by boring reality of wealth and institutions and information asymmetry that doesn't require exotic physics or time-viewing devices, leaving Project Looking Glass as permanent question, permanent possibility, permanent conspiracy theory that will continue circulating, continue being believed by some and dismissed by others, continue serving its function of explaining the inexplicable by invoking suppressed technology, continue existing in the space between classified truth and elaborate fiction, where verification is impossible and where belief depends not on evidence but on prior commitments about whether such technology could exist, whether governments would develop it, whether whistleblowers are telling truth or constructing mythology, whether the future is knowable or fundamentally uncertain, whether Project Looking Glass shows all possible futures or shows nothing because it exists or because it was always just story, always just legend, always just the conspiracy theory about technology that sees tomorrow. Project Preserve, Destiny, Looking Glass technology, and seeing the future. In the deepest levels of classified research, beyond what congressional oversight reaches, beyond what even most military personnel know exists, there allegedly sits a device that violates everything we understand about time, causality, and the fixed nature of reality. It's called Looking Glass, and according to whistleblowers who've risked everything to speak about it, this technology allows operators to view probable futures with enough clarity and detail that decisions affecting millions of lives are being made based on what the device shows. Not predictions, not forecasts derived from data analysis. Actual visual access to what will happen or what might happen, presented as scenes that can be observed, recorded, and studied. The implications are so profound that if the technology exists and works even partially as described, then everything you believe about free will, determinism, and humanity's trajectory through time needs revision. We might be living in a timeline that's already been viewed, decisions made by people who've seen the consequences before choosing, reality itself bent toward outcomes someone decided were preferable after watching the alternatives play out. The name Project Preserve Destiny suggests the purpose explicitly. Not just seeing the future, but preserving a specific version of it, guiding events toward desired outcomes while avoiding timelines that lead to catastrophe or scenarios the controllers find unacceptable. The project allegedly began decades ago, possibly as an extension of work that occurred during the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project, research into electromagnetic manipulation of time and consciousness that was never publicly acknowledged, but produced results significant enough to warrant continued development in deeper black programs. By the time Looking Glass became operational, the technology had supposedly advanced to the point where viewing future timelines was reliable enough to base policy decisions on what operators saw. The device itself is described through fragmented testimony from people who claim to have seen it or worked with it. A chair, similar to descriptions from Montauk, where an operator sits surrounded by technology that interfaces with their consciousness. But instead of amplifying psychic abilities or projecting thoughts into reality, Looking Glass channels awareness forward through time, allowing the operator to perceive events that haven't happened yet. The viewing isn't passive like watching video. It's experiential, immersive, the operator existing in a future moment as if they're actually there, seeing through eyes that haven't opened yet, perceiving details with clarity that makes the experience indistinguishable from present reality. Dan Burish is the name most associated with Looking Glass testimony. He claims to have worked as a microbiologist on classified projects and gained access to information about the technology through his security clearance and project involvement. According to Burish, Looking Glass doesn't show a single fixed future, but rather displays probable timelines, branches that extend from present decision points. The operators can navigate between these probability streams, examining different versions of what might occur, based on specific choices made in the present. It's not fortune-telling, it's systematic exploration of consequence space, mapping how present actions ripple forward through time and manifest in different outcomes depending on which path is chosen. The technology allegedly operates through manipulating what physicists would call the quantum foam, the seething probability field that underlies space-time at the smallest scales. By creating specific electromagnetic field configurations and interfacing human consciousness with these fields, LookingGlass somehow allows awareness to extend beyond the present moment and sample information from states that exist in probability but haven't yet collapsed into experienced reality. It sounds like science fiction, but quantum mechanics already acknowledges that particles exist in superposition of states until observed, and that information seems to flow backward through time in ways that violate our intuitive understanding of cause and effect. LookingGlass would be weaponized application of these principles, consciousness used as the observation mechanism to sample futures before they become present. What makes Burrish's testimony particularly unsettling is his claim that operators saw something consistent across multiple probable timelines, a convergence point that appears in nearly every future they examined. He describes it vaguely, referring to a cataclysmic event, or transition, occurring in the first few decades of the 21st century, visible across different probability branches, with only the details varying. Some timelines showed environmental catastrophe. Others showed technological singularity where artificial intelligence transcends human control. Some displayed war or pandemic or societal collapse. The specifics differed, but the presence of major disruption remained constant, as if certain futures are more probable than others, certain outcomes carrying such weight in the probability field that avoiding them requires enormous effort or might be impossible. This convergence creates a horrifying scenario for anyone with access to LookingGlass. If you can see that catastrophe is probable or inevitable across most timelines, what do you do with that information? Do you tell the public, causing panic and potentially triggering the very collapse you're trying to avoid? Do you remain silent and attempt to guide events subtly, making policy decisions designed to steer toward the least damaging timeline without revealing why you're making those choices? Or do you conclude that the future is fixed, that LookingGlass shows what will happen regardless of intervention, and use the technology only to prepare for the inevitable while maintaining control over the transition? Project Preserve Destiny allegedly represents the third option evolved into active strategy. The idea isn't preventing the convergence, but controlling it, ensuring it unfolds in a manner that preserves certain power structures, certain groups, certain outcomes deemed essential by whoever makes these decisions. If collapse is coming, then prepare underground facilities for continuity of government. If environmental catastrophe is inevitable, ensure resources are positioned where they'll be accessible afterward. If technological singularity approaches, try to steer the artificial intelligence toward alignment with human controllers, rather than allowing it to develop independently. The future is being stage managed based on what LookingGlass shows, reality sculpted toward the least worst option from a menu of probable disasters. But there's a deeper problem, a paradox that sits at the heart of LookingGlass technology. If you view a future and then make decisions based on what you saw, you've changed the conditions that led to that future, potentially making it less likely to occur. This creates a feedback loop where the act of looking affects what's being seen, where futures are constantly shifting based on how observers respond to previous observations. The technology might be chasing its own tail, viewing timelines that change every time someone acts on the information, creating a hall of mirrors where no future is stable because the present keeps adjusting based on forward-looking intelligence. Some testimony suggests LookingGlass began showing increasingly chaotic or unstable results as it was used more extensively, as if excessive viewing was damaging the timeline structure itself, or as if some force was actively interfering with the technology. Operators reported seeing futures that made no sense, paradoxical outcomes, or scenarios where human civilization simply disappeared with no clear cause. Was this the device malfunctioning, reaching limits of what consciousness can perceive when pushed too far forward? Was it evidence that excessive timeline manipulation creates instability, that too much looking causes probability waves to collapse unpredictably? Or was something on the other end of the temporal connection looking back, aware it was being observed from the past, taking actions to conceal or distort what the operators could see? There are also claims that multiple nations developed looking glass technology independently, or through shared research, meaning different groups might be viewing futures and making decisions that conflict, each trying to steer toward their preferred timeline. If the United States sees and prepares for one future, while Russia or China sees and prepares for another, their competing preparations could create conditions that make both futures less likely, while opening probability space for outcomes no one anticipated or wanted. The timeline becomes a battlefield where present actions are weapons aimed at killing undesirable futures while nurturing preferred ones. And human civilization is caught in the crossfire between competing visions of what should happen. The ethical implications are staggering. If a small group has access to future viewing technology, they possess power that makes traditional, political, military, or economic dominance look trivial by comparison. They know what will happen before it happens. They can position resources, make investments, start or prevent wars, all with knowledge of outcomes before anyone else even understands the full situation. This is beyond insider trading or tactical advantage. It's steering human destiny based on privileged information that no democratic process can access or contest. How do you vote against decisions made by people who've seen the consequences of not making them? How do you resist policy when its architects can claim, truthfully or not, that they viewed the alternatives, and this path leads to survival, while others lead to extinction? There's also the question of self-fulfilling prophecy at civilization scale. If Looking Glass consistently shows certain futures, and decisions are made to prepare for those futures, do the preparations themselves make the futures more likely? Building underground continuity facilities because you see collapse could redistribute resources in ways that make collapse more probable. Preparing for war because you see conflict could create tensions that manifest the war. Treating artificial intelligence as an existential threat because you saw it transcend control could lead to developmental approaches that ensure it views humanity as enemy when it finally emerges. The technology meant to help avoid catastrophe might be the mechanism ensuring it arrives. Burish also described seeing something in the far future that transcended the near-term convergence point, a version of humanity that had survived whatever transition occurs and evolved into something different, beings with capabilities that seem almost supernatural from our perspective, existing in harmony with technologies and consciousness patterns we can't currently comprehend. He referred to these as future humans, or possibly extraterrestrials, who are actually our descendants, having developed time travel and returning to various points in their past, our present, to observe or guide events. The implication is that the Greys, the beings associated with UFO encounters and abduction phenomena, might not be aliens from other planets, but humans from our own future, come back to ensure their timeline remains stable, perhaps even using Looking Glass technology themselves to identify critical junctures where intervention is necessary. This creates a mind-bending possibility. If future humans are using time travel to influence the past, and present humans are using Looking Glass to view and manipulate probable futures. Then reality is caught in a loop where cause and effect blur completely. The future is shaping the present, which creates the future, which sends agents back to shape the past, which becomes the present. Free will in this model is complicated beyond comprehension. Are we making choices or executing a script written by our future selves who already know what we'll choose because they've already lived through it from the other end of time? The reason Project Preserve Destiny remains classified, if it exists, is obvious. Acknowledging Looking Glass technology would trigger immediate demand for access, for oversight, for public input into decisions being made based on future viewing. It would raise unanswerable questions about determinism and free will. It would create panic about whatever convergence point operators have identified, even if revealing that information might help avoid it. And most critically, it would expose that a very small group has been making choices that affect everyone based on information available only to them, effectively running shadow government that transcends normal political structures because it operates with knowledge pulled from tomorrow. The few who've spoken about Looking Glass have faced predictable responses: ridicule, dismissal, accusations of mental illness or fraud. Burrish's testimony is questioned on every detail, his credentials disputed, his story picked apart by skeptics who note inconsistencies and lack of physical evidence. But the technology he describes is theoretically possible, according to some interpretations of quantum mechanics and general relativity. Closed time-like curves, retrocausality, quantum entanglement across time. These aren't science fiction concepts, but legitimate areas of theoretical physics. If the government invested in weaponizing these principles, the way they weaponized atomic physics, the result might look exactly like Looking Glass. And there are strange corroborations if you look for them. High-level strategic decisions that seem to make no sense based on publicly available information, but that in retrospect appear brilliant or prescient. Preparations for scenarios that seemed paranoid until they suddenly became relevant. Massive resource investments in projects whose purpose isn't clear until years later, when they turn out to be exactly what was needed. Are these just competent planning and lucky forecasting? Or are they decisions made by people who've already seen how things unfold, who know what's needed because they've watched versions of the future where those preparations saved civilizations, or where their absence led to collapse? The most disturbing aspect of Project Preserve Destiny isn't the technology itself, but what it suggests about reality. If the future can be viewed, then in some sense it already exists, laid out in probability space waiting to be experienced. But if viewing it changes it, then it exists in superposition, multiple versions simultaneously real until collapsed by observation and decision. We might be living in a curated timeline, a carefully selected branch chosen from thousands of alternatives because someone with access to Looking Glass decided this version was optimal or least catastrophic. Every major event, every seeming accident or coincidence could be the result of timeline management, reality steered towards specific outcomes by handlers who've seen what happens otherwise. And what about the convergence Burrish described, the transition point visible across multiple futures? Are we approaching it now, living through the years when whatever Looking Glass operators saw decades ago is finally manifesting? Every crisis, every technological leap, every moment of instability could be part of the pattern they identified. Events unfolding according to what was viewed long before they occurred. If the operators saw this and made preparations, then whatever happens next has already been planned for, already been shaped by decisions made based on knowledge of outcomes that haven't arrived yet, but have already been observed by consciousness stretched forward through probability space. Project Preserve. Destiny represents the ultimate conspiracy. Not hidden events in the past, but hidden knowledge of the future, used to shape the present in ways we can't see or understand. Somewhere in a facility we'll never visit, using technology that won't be acknowledged, operators might still be sitting in that chair, consciousness extending forward through time, watching what comes, reporting to authorities who make decisions based on those reports, steering all of us toward futures they've selected from the alternatives they've been shown. We're passengers in a vehicle whose destination was determined by people who've already visited it, living through a timeline that's already been viewed and approved, heading toward whatever convergence point appears across the probability branches, unable to know if we're moving toward salvation or catastrophe. Because the people with access to that information decided long ago that we're better off not knowing. That the future must be preserved exactly as they've seen it, regardless of whether any of us would choose differently if given the chance to look through the glass ourselves. Polybius, the arcade game that drove players insane. In 1981, according to urban legend that emerged decades later, a mysterious arcade game called Polybius appeared in a handful of suburban Portland, Oregon locations, installed without fanfare or advertising, drawing players through word of mouth about its intensely addictive and disorienting gameplay. The game allegedly featured abstract vector graphics, psychedelic color patterns, and gameplay mechanics that were simultaneously compelling and disturbing, drawing players into extended sessions that left them experiencing severe psychological and physiological effects. Within weeks of playing Polybius, people reportedly suffered amnesia, night terrors, seizures, hallucinations, and profound aversion to video games in general, symptoms so severe that several players allegedly required hospitalization for psychiatric evaluation. The machines were supposedly monitored by men in black who would visit the arcade locations after hours, opening the cabinets not to collect quarters, but to retrieve data, as if the game itself was collecting information beyond high scores, as if player interactions were being studied for purposes the arcade owners didn't understand and weren't authorized to know. Then, after approximately 1 month of operation, the Polybius machines vanished as mysteriously as they'd appeared, removed from all locations simultaneously, with the company allegedly responsible. Sinneslotion, a name that means sense deletion. In German, having no traceable existence, no business records, no other products, no employees who could be identified or interviewed. The game became legendary in retro gaming communities as the ultimate lost arcade cabinet, the subject of desperate searches by collectors and historians who found no physical evidence that Polybius ever existed. No ROM dumps, no circuit boards, no cabinets, no advertisements, no contemporary documentation from 1981 mentioning the game. Yet the legend persists with remarkable consistency across sources, creating the question of whether Polybius was a real psychological experiment disguised as entertainment, a government or military program testing subliminal messaging or consciousness manipulation through gaming platforms, or whether it's entirely fictional, an internet-age urban legend that has achieved such cultural penetration that people now remember or claim to have played a game that never existed, their memories constructed from the legend itself, rather than from actual experience, creating false recollection through the power of shared narrative, leaving Polybius as either the most successfully suppressed arcade game in history or the most successful fictional creation masquerading as suppressed history. A game that supposedly drove players insane, and that might itself be driving researchers and enthusiasts insane in their attempts to determine whether it was ever real. The timeline is crucial to understanding Polybius skepticism. The game allegedly appeared in 1981, but the first documented mention of it doesn't appear until 1998, when it was added to coinop.org, a website cataloging arcade games, listed as if it were a real title alongside genuinely documented games. The listing provided brief information about its existence and effects, but cited no sources, included no screenshots or technical specifications, and was added by an unknown contributor. From this single database entry, the legend spread through gaming forums, paranormal websites, and eventually mainstream internet culture, each retelling adding details and elaborations until Polybius became one of the most famous lost arcade games, despite having no contemporary evidence of existence. The 17-year gap between alleged release and first documentation is the central problem. 1981 had active arcade gaming culture, enthusiast magazines, local news coverage of arcade trends and controversies. If a game had caused the dramatic effects attributed to Polybius, multiple hospitalizations, seizures, government agents monitoring machines, it would have generated contemporary news coverage, health warnings, investigations by consumer protection agencies. Arcade owners who installed machines causing such problems would have removed them and reported to distributors. Players who suffered would have sought legal recourse. Parents would have complained to authorities. Yet no contemporary newspaper articles, no health department records, no consumer complaints from 1981 mention anything resembling Polybius, suggesting either the story is entirely fabricated or the suppression was so complete and so effective that every piece of contemporary evidence was eliminated, which seems implausible given the number of independent parties who would have been involved. The name Polybius itself is interesting. It references the ancient Greek historian Polybius, who wrote extensively about Rome and who developed techniques for encoding secret messages. Naming a supposedly experimental mind control game after a historian associated with cryptography and hidden information might be intentional, meaningful choice by whoever created the game, or might be someone later creating the legend choosing a name that would add layers of significance and conspiratorial implication, making the game seem more sophisticated and intentional than random arcade cabinet number 7 would suggest. The company name Sinneslotion, sense deletion, is almost too perfect, too on the nose for a supposed psychological experiment. Real covert programs use innocuous cover names, generic corporate titles that don't advertise their actual purposes. A company literally named Sense Deletion, creating a mind-altering arcade game, is either remarkably blatant or is someone crafting a legend and choosing a dramatically appropriate but implausibly obvious name, favoring narrative coherence over plausible operational security. The Men in Black collecting data is a borrowed trope from UFO lore and conspiracy culture, generally. Mysterious government agents who appear to suppress information and monitor civilian encounters with classified projects. Their appearance in the Polybius legend connects the game to broader conspiracy narratives, suggests government involvement without requiring specification of which agency or what program, creates atmosphere of surveillance and control that's thematically appropriate, but that's also a recycled element from other legends, rather than a detail that emerged organically from witness accounts. The symptoms attributed to Polybius, amnesia, night terrors, aversion to gaming, are consistent with severe psychological trauma or with certain neurological conditions. But they're also symptoms that would make victims unreliable witnesses. If you develop amnesia and aversion to the thing that caused your symptoms, you can't provide clear testimony about what the game was like, what happened during play, what specific elements triggered your reaction. This creates a built-in explanation for why detailed descriptions of gameplay don't exist from alleged victims. They can't remember or can't bring themselves to engage with gaming topics, conveniently making the central evidence inaccessible. The actual arcade gaming landscape of 1981 does include some relevant context. This was the peak of arcade gaming's golden age. With new games appearing constantly, with intense competition for player attention and quarters. experimental games with unusual mechanics or presentation did exist, and some games did produce seizures in photosensitive individuals, leading to warnings and modifications. The possibility that an experimental game with particularly intense visuals or novel gameplay mechanics could have caused adverse reactions in a subset of players isn't implausible. What's implausible is that such a game would then be completely memory holed, with no remaining physical evidence, no contemporary documentation, no circuit boards or ROM chips surviving in the hands of collectors or in storage facilities. The Portland location is significant because Portland has reputation for oddness, for being placed where strange things happen or are more readily accepted. Setting the legend in Portland, rather than more conventional locations, adds plausibility through association with a city known for its counterculture and unusual characteristics. But Portland's arcade scene in the 80s had active participants who are still alive and accessible, and when investigators have attempted to find anyone who actually remembers Polybius appearing in Portland arcades in 1981, they've come up empty. Arcade operators, collectors, enthusiasts who were active in that scene at that time don't remember the game, don't remember hearing about mysterious health effects, don't have the collective memory that would exist if something as dramatic as Polybius actually occurred. The psychological experiment theory proposes that Polybius was a military or intelligence project, testing whether interactive entertainment could be used for behavior modification, consciousness alteration, or information gathering. The game would be a disguised testing apparatus placed in public locations where targets would voluntarily engage with it, providing data about how humans respond to specific visual patterns, gameplay mechanics, or subliminal messaging embedded in the game code. This makes Polybius part of the MK Ultra lineage, similar to documented programs where drugs and psychological techniques were tested on unwitting subjects, just using arcade gaming as the delivery mechanism. The technology to create such effects would depend on what specific outcomes were intended. If the goal was inducing seizures or disorientation, rapid flashing patterns and specific color combinations can affect neurological function, particularly in photosensitive individuals. If the goal was subliminal messaging, frames could be inserted below conscious perception threshold, containing images or text that might influence behavior or belief. If the goal was addiction or compulsion, gameplay mechanics could be designed using operant conditioning principles, variable reward schedules, and difficulty curves that create obsessive play patterns. All of this is theoretically possible with 1981 technology, though whether it could be done effectively and covertly remains questionable. The complete absence of physical evidence is what ultimately makes Polybius most likely fictional. Arcade cabinets are large, durable objects. Circuit boards and ROM chips are physical components that don't simply vanish. Even if machines were recalled and destroyed, components circulate through secondary markets, sit in storage, end up in private collections. The arcade collecting community is extensive and dedicated, with people who specialize in tracking down and preserving rare and obscure games. If Polybius machines existed in commercial deployment, even briefly, physical components should exist somewhere in collections, in storage facilities, in landfills, discoverable through forensic investigation, if not through active collecting. The ROM code particularly should exist. Video game code is copied, archived, shared through enthusiast networks. Even extremely rare and obscure arcade games from the 80s have had their ROMs dumped and preserved. The absence of Polybius ROM, despite intensive searching by emulation and preservation communities, strongly suggests there was never ROM to find, never game code that existed, because the game itself never existed except as story. But the legend serves psychological and cultural functions, regardless of whether the game was real. It expresses anxieties about technology's effects on consciousness, about corporations or governments using entertainment as tool for manipulation or control, about the addictive properties of gaming and whether they're natural byproducts of engaging design or deliberate exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities. Polybius as legend allows discussion of these concerns through the narrative of a game that took these possibilities to extreme, that was purely exploitative, that damaged players deliberately for experimental purposes, making explicit the implicit fears about what entertainment technology might be doing to users. The internet age has transformed how legends like Polybius spread and persist. Pre-internet, urban legends were limited by geographical transmission, by the telephone game distortion that occurs through oral retelling. Internet allows legends to be documented in text, to spread globally instantly, to accumulate elaborations that get added to the canonical version, to be researched and debunked, and yet continue circulating because debunking reaches different audiences than the original legend. Polybius exemplifies this dynamic. It's been thoroughly debunked, with researchers demonstrating the absence of contemporary evidence. Yet it persists in gaming culture, gets referenced in TV shows and video games, maintains presence as the game that drove players crazy, despite the overwhelming likelihood that it never existed. Some researchers have proposed that Polybius might be based on confused memories of real games. Tempest, released in 1981, had vector graphics and intense visual effects that could induce discomfort. Various arcade games from that era did cause seizures in photosensitive players before warnings became standard. Perhaps memories of these real incidents became conflated and elaborated into the Polybius legend, creating a fictional game from fragmentary real experiences with multiple different games and incidents. The false memory angle is particularly interesting. If enough people hear detailed descriptions of Polybius, some percentage may develop false memories of having encountered or played it, their brains constructing memory-like experiences from the legend rather than from actual events. Studies of false memory demonstrate that people can be induced to remember events that didn't happen if they're given enough detail and social confirmation, if the suggested event is plausible within their life context, if they're repeatedly exposed to the narrative. Polybius provides all these elements for people who were arcade gamers in the early 80s, potentially creating a population of people who genuinely believe they remember a game that never existed. Whether Polybius was real psychological experiment, real game with effects that were exaggerated into legend, or pure fiction that has achieved legendary status through internet propagation, the game, or its legend, has become part of gaming culture, a story that gamers know and reference, that represents anxieties about technology and consciousness, that serves as cautionary tale about entertainment that's too engaging or too manipulative, that warns about hidden agendas in commercial products, that suggests reality might contain suppressed histories and removed artifacts that left no trace except stories that persist despite lack of evidence. The search for Polybius continues among some enthusiasts, convinced that somewhere physical evidence exists, that ROM dumps or circuit boards or cabinet components sit in storage waiting to be discovered and prove the legend true. Others have created modern versions, hoax Polybius cabinets, or ROM hacks that attempt to recreate what the legendary game might have been like, blurring the line further between historical artifact and contemporary fiction, making Polybius real in the present, even if it was never real in the past. And perhaps that's the ultimate truth of Polybius, that it's more powerful as legend than it could have been as actual game, that the story of a mind-altering arcade cabinet serves cultural and psychological purposes that don't require the game to have been real, that Polybius exists perfectly in the space of maybe happened and probably didn't, of suppressed truth and creative fiction, of conspiracy theory and urban legend, occupying the same uncertain territory as so many other stories that can't be proven, but can't be entirely dismissed, that persist because they express something true about fears and possibilities, even if the specific events described never occurred, leaving Polybius as the game that drove players insane, or the legend that drives researchers insane trying to verify it. The arcade cabinet that appeared and disappeared in 1981, taking players' sanity with it, or the story that appeared in 1998 and has been taking researchers' time and credibility ever since, as they search for evidence of something that all available data suggests never existed outside imagination and internet. A game that was never programmed and never installed and never played, except in the collective consciousness where legends live, where Polybius will remain. As long as people wonder whether somewhere, somehow, maybe it actually was real. Maybe the men in black did collect the machines. Maybe the evidence was successfully suppressed. Maybe Sinneslöschen was real, and the sense deletion they accomplished included deleting all trace of their own existence and their experimental game, leaving only the legend, only the story, only the persistent urban myth of Polybius. The arcade game that drove players insane, the game that might never have existed, but that exists now as legend, as cautionary tale, as mystery that may never be solved because there's nothing to solve, no truth to uncover. Except that humans create powerful stories about things that frighten or fascinate us, and Polybius, real or fictional, has become one of those stories, permanent fixture in gaming folklore, permanent mystery in conspiracy theory catalogs, permanent question that will likely never receive definitive answer, because the evidence we'd need to prove or disprove it vanished in 1981, or never existed at all, leaving us only with the legend of the game that was too effective, that worked too well, that accessed consciousness in ways that entertainment shouldn't, that drove players insane and then disappeared as completely as if it had never existed, taking with it any certainty about whether any of this actually happened, or whether Polybius is entirely fiction that has successfully masqueraded, though, as suppressed history, leaving us to wonder forever about the arcade cabinet that might have stood in Portland suburbs for 1 month in 1981, might have damaged players' minds, might have been government experiment or corporate accident, or might simply be the most successful gaming urban legend ever created, a story so compelling and so detailed that decades later, people still search for evidence, still believe it might be real, still feel the pull of a mystery that cannot be solved because there's nothing to find, no game to discover, no truth to reveal, except that sometimes the most powerful games are the ones that exist only in imagination, only in legend, only in the persistent story of Polybius, the game that drove players insane, or the game that never existed at all. Number stations, mysterious radio, broadcasts that never stop. Imagine sitting alone in a dark room at 3 a.m, slowly turning the dial on a shortwave radio. Through the static and interference between the fading signals of distant music stations and the crackle of atmospheric noise, you suddenly hear a voice. It's a woman speaking Spanish, but something about her tone isn't quite right. She's not conversing, not announcing, not communicating in any normal sense. She's simply reading numbers. Atención, atención. 3, 7, 2, 9, 4, 8. The voice continues, emotionless and precise, reading 5-digit groups with mechanical rhythm. You listen for a minute, 5 minutes, 10, and the numbers never stop, never explain themselves, never acknowledge that anyone is listening. Then, as abruptly as it began, the transmission ends. Silence. You're left in the darkness, wondering what you just heard, who was meant to hear it, and what those numbers might have instructed someone, somewhere, to do. This isn't fiction. This is happening right now, on frequencies you can access, with equipment you can buy online. Across the shortwave radio spectrum, Voices speak into the void continuously, reading numbers that sound random but carry meaning someone desperately needs to know. They've been doing this for decades, probably longer than anyone publicly admits. No government claims them. No official source acknowledges their purpose. Yet they persist, night after night, broadcasting instructions we can hear but never understand, coordinating operations we'll never know about, moving pieces on a chessboard we can't see. The Cold War made these stations infamous, though they existed before and continue long after. Intelligence agencies needed a way to communicate with agents operating in hostile territory, people who couldn't risk meeting handlers, couldn't use telephones or telegrams that could be monitored, couldn't do anything that would reveal they were receiving instructions from a foreign power. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity and absolutely unbreakable in its security. Broadcast encrypted messages using one-time pad encryption over shortwave radio. The agent needs only a radio and a pad of random numbers. When the transmission comes, they write down the broadcast numbers, apply the corresponding section of their pad, and the message reveals itself. Then they burn that page of the pad. Without that specific pad, the message is mathematically impossible to decrypt, even with unlimited computing power and infinite time. The enemy can record every transmission, can listen to every broadcast, can capture every signal, and still learn nothing. What makes this system so unsettling is its openness. These aren't hidden communications on classified frequencies. Anyone can listen. Shortwave enthusiasts stumbled onto number stations decades ago and have been documenting them ever since, creating catalogs of stations identified by their characteristics because no one officially names them. The Lincolnshire Poacher began each transmission with bars from an English folk song before a woman's voice read number groups. The station broadcast for over 30 years, believed to be operated by British intelligence from Cyprus, aimed at agents in the Middle East and beyond. Then, in 2008, it simply stopped. No announcement, no explanation. The agents who had spent years listening for that specific musical phrase at specific times would have tuned in one day to find only silence. What does that silence mean? Were the operations complete? Were the agents extracted? Or was something darker implied by that sudden termination? The buzzer is still active, broadcasting from Russia on the same frequency it's occupied for decades. Most of the time, it produces exactly what its name suggests: a harsh, monotonous buzzing tone that repeats approximately 25 times per minute, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. Occasionally, the buzzing stops, and a Russian voice reads call signs, numbers, or brief phrases before the buzzing resumes. Sometimes months pass between voice transmissions. What purpose does that constant buzzing serve? Is it claiming the frequency, ensuring no one else uses it? Is it a heartbeat signal, proof the system is operational and monitoring? Or is the buzzing itself encoded information, variations in tone or timing, carrying messages that sophisticated receivers can extract, while casual listeners hear only monotonous repetition? Then there are the children. Some stations use voices that sound impossibly young, speaking with the clarity and innocence of childhood, while reading number sequences that might be ordering surveillance, dead drops, or worse. The Swedish Rhapsody opened with an eerie music box melody. Then a young girl's voice counted in German. Eins, zwei, drei, vier. The juxtaposition of childlike voice with the cold reality of espionage creates profound unease. Why children's voices? Perhaps they're distinctive, impossible to confuse with normal radio traffic. Perhaps early speech synthesis systems produced these tones more easily. Or perhaps there's something deliberately disturbing about it, something designed to ensure the recipient pays attention. recognizes their specific station among the dozens of broadcasts crossing the shortwave bands on any given night. In 1998, the veil lifted briefly during a U.S. federal prosecution of Cuban intelligence officers operating in Florida. Among the evidence presented in court were recordings of number stations, one-time pads found in the defendant's possession, and decrypted messages proving that broadcast numbers, when processed with the correct pad, yielded intelligence instructions. The Cuban agents had been listening to stations broadcasting from their homeland, receiving orders about what to observe, what to report, who to monitor. The trial provided rare official confirmation of what everyone already knew, but rarely acknowledged. These broadcasts aren't mysteries or anomalies. They're active intelligence operations, communications between handlers and assets, ongoing coordination of espionage conducted completely in the open, yet absolutely secure. But that case revealed only what one cell was doing, one network's operations. How many other agents listen to how many other stations? How many broadcasts per night carry instructions we'll never know about? The shortwave spectrum is vast, and number stations occupy only tiny slivers of it. Yet enthusiasts have documented hundreds of distinct stations over the decades, broadcasting in Russian, Spanish, English, German, Czech, Korean, Mandarin. Every major intelligence service and many minor ones apparently use this method. Right now, as you read this, someone somewhere is tuning their radio to a predetermined frequency, waiting for the signal that tells them their message is coming, preparing to write down numbers that will tell them what to do next. The broadcasts follow patterns that speak to careful planning and operational security. Many maintain rigid schedules, same frequency, same time, same day of the week. Others appear to be event-driven, activating only when there's a message to transmit. Some broadcast brief transmissions lasting minutes. Others run for hours, reading thousands of number groups as if the message is enormous, or as if multiple recipients are pulling different sections from the same broadcast. The formats vary in ways that probably mean something to insiders. 4-figure groups versus 5-figure groups. Letters instead of numbers. Phonetic alphabets. Binary tones that might be automated encryption rather than human-readable content. Each variation suggests different purposes, different operational requirements, different levels in whatever hierarchy coordinates these shadow communications. What haunts the listener is the certainty that these numbers mean something, combined with the impossibility of ever knowing what. You can record them, analyze them, track them, correlate them with world events, and still you're on the outside. The information is right there, transmitted clearly enough that even a cheap radio picks it up. Yet it's as inaccessible as if locked in the deepest vault. Somewhere, someone applied their one-time pad to that transmission and now knows something you never will. Maybe they know where to go for a meeting. Maybe they know what documents to photograph. Maybe they know it's time to disappear, that their cover is blown, that they need to reach an extraction point before counterintelligence finds them. The numbers told them something urgent enough to justify maintaining this entire broadcasting infrastructure, this network of transmitters and scheduled transmissions and agents listening in lonely rooms with radios and pads they'll destroy after reading. Some stations have broadcast for so long they've become fixtures of the shortwave landscape, expected and monitored by enthusiasts who note every variation. When the Lincolnshire poacher fell silent, the community that had tracked it for years felt the absence like a missing tooth, a gap where something significant had been. When new stations appear, using identifiers no one's heard before, speculation runs wild about what nation launched them, what operations they're coordinating, whether their appearance correlates with geopolitical tensions or newly activated intelligence priorities. The community creates databases, archives recordings, maintains schedules of active stations. This crowdsourced surveillance of intelligence communications maps the shadow world more thoroughly than any official oversight could. Yet it reveals nothing about content, nothing about purpose beyond the obvious fact that secrets are being transmitted. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing you're listening to active espionage, that the transmission you're hearing might be instructing an agent to take actions that will affect world events, that someone's life or operation depends on receiving these numbers correctly. The stakes are invisible, but real. If an agent misses their scheduled broadcast, do they have backup protocols? If they copy the numbers wrong, does the decrypted message become gibberish, leaving them uncertain whether to act or wait for confirmation? If counterintelligence is listening, do they try to jam the signal? Or do they let it broadcast because locating the transmitter tells them less than identifying who's listening would? The technology seems almost quaint now, a relic of an era before encrypted smartphones and secure satellite links. Yet numbers stations haven't disappeared. They've adapted, incorporating digital modes and new transmission techniques. But the fundamental concept persists because it works. The agent transmits nothing, accesses nothing, does nothing that surveillance can detect except owning a radio, which is perfectly legal and completely common. The broadcast itself is public, deniable, and unbreakable without the pad. Modern encryption can be attacked through mathematical breakthroughs, implementation flaws, or computing advances. One-time pad encryption, properly implemented, is the only provably unbreakable cipher. As long as the pad is truly random, used only once, and kept secret, the message is absolutely secure, regardless of who intercepts it or what resources they apply to cracking it. Some broadcasts seem designed to confuse or overwhelm. Stations that transmit constantly, filling the spectrum with noise and numbers, making it harder to distinguish which transmissions are real and which might be deception. Broadcasts that follow patterns for years, then suddenly change format, identifier, or schedule. Stations that appear briefly, then disappear, leaving listeners uncertain whether they heard an actual intelligence transmission or something else entirely. The fog of uncertainty serves operational security. If counterintelligence can't reliably distinguish real agent communications from noise and deception, they can't efficiently focus resources on tracking the meaningful traffic. There are also anomalies that defy easy explanation, even from people who've studied number stations for decades. Broadcasts that don't fit typical patterns, transmissions using modulation or encoding that doesn't match known intelligence communication profiles, stations that appear in frequency ranges or formats that seem impractical for the supposed purpose. Are these experiments with new techniques? Cover for something else? Communications for purposes we haven't considered? The shortwave spectrum contains mysteries beyond even the acknowledged mystery of number stations themselves. Late at night, when atmospheric conditions allow shortwave signals to travel thousands of miles, when the spectrum fills with distant broadcasts from around the world, you can scan through and find them. The voices reading numbers in languages you don't speak. The tones pulsing in patterns that might encode information beyond the obvious audio. The stations that identify themselves with musical phrases or call signs that mean nothing to you, but everything to someone listening with a pad and pencil, ready to decode instructions that might send them into danger, that might save their life, that might be the last message they receive before something goes wrong and they're never heard from again. This is happening now, not in the past, not in spy novels, but right now on frequencies you can access. Someone is broadcasting, someone is listening, someone is decoding messages that you and I will never read, taking actions we'll never know about, playing roles in operations that remain secret, perhaps, forever. The numbers continue, mechanical and relentless, carrying meaning through the noise, connecting handlers to assets across hostile borders, and through surveillance that can intercept anything except information secured by mathematics and randomness. The voices read on into the darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, someone is writing down every number, knowing their life might depend on getting it exactly right.